A UN nuclear chief has stressed that the world is fortunate. The world is fortunate a nuclear accident hasn't happened in Ukraine just yet. Now, ahead of a widely anticipated Ukrainian counteroffensive, the Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency asked both Moscow and Kyiv to commit to preventing any attack on Zaporizhzhia, Europe's largest nuclear power plant, and that's in order to avoid a nuclear accident.
I laid out five principles that must be observed in order to avoid a nuclear accident at this moment of increased military activity around the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. I had very clear expressions of support about it, and as a result of this, we are going to be reinforcing the presence of the agency through our mission, our permanent mission deployed in Zaporizhzhia, and we will be also looking at the important elements included in these principles that refer to the necessity to avoid attacks from or to the plant. They include the necessity to avoid militarizing the facility, and when I say militarizing, what we have in mind is that the plant becomes a place where military heavy equipment is present, deployed, or stored. We are also talking about the necessity to ensure the continued external power supply. So we are talking about, importantly, the necessity to protect the safety systems of the plant, and we say it very clearly, avoid acts of sabotage at the plant. And lastly, of course, that this should be upheld by all. So this is why I say that without getting into unwarranted, naive optimism, that today is a day where, Ignacio, together, we have taken a step in the right direction.
Well, for the very latest, we can now speak with Arise chief correspondent John Cookson, who's in the Ukrainian city of Kyiv. John, great to have you. A lot of claims being thrown here and there. Moscow claims to have sunk Ukraine's last warship, and Russian authorities say Ukrainian drone strike is responsible for the oil refinery fire. Based on what you're hearing, what's real and what's not?
Hi there, great to be on Newsday as always. Well, look, this counteroffensive that journalists have been talking about for months now, it was a spring offensive, then it can be this summer offensive. I think we can all agree now it's not going to be like D-Day. It's going to be a quiet offensive, and this quiet offensive has clearly started. We have these attacks, these drone attacks in Moscow and in Kyiv recently. The Russians claim to have sunk a warship. We don't know whether that's true. The Ukrainian warship, we don't know whether it's true. There's a lot of misinformation flying around at the moment, and both governments putting out, frankly, propaganda. And it's just, we've got to try and make sense of it all. But it seems as if this counteroffensive that Zelensky has been talking about for a long time now is underway, but quietly. And of course, we had the attacks, the drone attacks in Moscow yesterday, clearly rattled Moscow's elite. It hit a residential area where the bigwigs live in Moscow, and they've no doubt raised that with Putin, who will be clearly angry at what's happened and be asking some big questions as to why and how those drones got through to Moscow, which must be one of the most heavily defended cities in the world. So big questions to be answered there by Moscow's military elite as to how this could have happened and how can they prevent it happening again. The fact is they probably can't, and probably more drones are underway, because it's clear that if drones fly at a very low level, as the Russians are doing them into Kyiv, they can get through. They can fool the defenses. So expect some more, I think, more drone attacks by both sides on Kyiv and in Moscow, using a new tactic. The other question being asked today is, who was behind those drone attacks on Moscow? The Kyiv government saying that they had no direct responsibility. note those words, no direct responsibility. They didn't say that they had no responsibility. And it's inconceivable that, frankly, that Zelensky's people weren't behind those attacks. But how did they carry it out? So the drones would have traveled at least 350 kilometers from Ukraine to reach Moscow. So they must have been fired from inside Ukraine, one would have thought. And yet the Ukrainians aren't known to have drones that can travel so far. So it is something of a mystery at the moment, although it has to be said that some of these drones can be bought on the black market, black market from any place in the world, frankly. And I'm sure that the Russians are looking at the drones, the debris that they picked up, and trying to identify which country they actually came from. All of this is causing a lot of nervousness in the capitals of NATO countries, including Washington. And we heard, of course, the White House spokesperson there saying that the White House doesn't support attacks in Russia itself, and that's part of the deal. That's the reason why Zelensky got his weapons from America, on condition that they're not used in Russia mainland. And yet here we have an example where it's clear someone has clearly used effective weapons on the Russian capital, and this is something that can so easily escalate into something much, much bigger.
John, I have to really stay on that because you mentioned so many points worth noting. Ukraine says they were not directly involved, meaning there might have been, there's a possibility that there was an indirect involvement. In the event that a country is identified to have been behind this, can you just imagine what that could mean in terms of retaliatory efforts by Russia?
Yeah, look, at the present time, we don't know who made these drones or where they came from, but we can be fairly certain that some military group within Ukraine itself fired those drones at Moscow. I mean, there has to be no doubt about that. They can't have been fired within Russia itself. I wouldn't have thought. So who are these people that apparently are operating distinctly from the regime in Kyiv? Now, there have been reports from American intelligence that there are groups, secret service groups within Ukraine who are operating independently and perhaps supported by the US in their activities. And you know, it's not unusual for secret agents to operate on their own, if you like. The CIA does it all the time. The MI6 operates freely at times without reference back every time to Downing Street or, in the CIA's case, to the White House. So it's quite likely that there is some other group within the Ukraine, some military group that has this has the green light, perhaps from Washington, to carry out these attacks, and they are distanced from Zelensky, and maybe he's aware of the attacks but doesn't authorize them on an individual basis. That's just an assumption on my part.
Well said, John. Now, when it comes to the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, it's been made quite clear that neither Russia nor Ukraine has committed to respect the 5 principles, that are laid out by the IAEA to try to safeguard Ukraine's Russian-occupied Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. Can you give us more insight on that?
This nuclear power plant is a massive worry. I was down there earlier this year in March, filming in the region, and this power plant is slap bang in the middle of a war zone. And when the counteroffensive gets going properly, it must be absolutely certain that there's a possibility of some rocket attack on the plant, which can cause a huge nuclear cloud. Let's just go back a little bit and say, as you said in the intro, it's the biggest, was the biggest, or is the biggest nuclear power plant in Europe. 5 of the 6 reactors have been shut down, and 1 is operating at a low level. That's not the problem. The problem is that these vast water pits where spent nuclear waste is stored has to be kept under control using electric power. Now, if the electric power is interrupted in any way, it can cause a meltdown, a massive meltdown, releasing millions of particles of atomic waste into the atmosphere to drift who knows where. Some experts are saying an accident there could be bigger than Chernobyl. Now, the IAEA, and you just saw Rafael Grossi there, has put down this 5-point plan, and he wants to put a ring of steel around the plant to make sure that it's safe from attack. He's asked the Russians and the Ukrainians not to attack the plant and not to store weapons there, because the Russians do store weapons there and fire at the Ukrainians on the other bank of the Dnipro River from the plant itself, and for the power to be maintained at all times, so we don't have this nuclear meltdown.
Well, it's been a pleasure as always. Arise Chief Correspondent John Cookson, thank you so much for your time and your insights. It's been a pleasure.